So Assalamu alaikum everyone who's joined us for this Lahore Literary Festival online talk titled Unspooling History Through Objects. My name is Sadia Gardezi and I'm an artist and I work in visual storytelling at Project Dastan. And I'm very pleased to have two guests from India with me today. The first is Anjal Malhotra, who is an artist and oral historian working with memory and material culture. She is the author of Remnants of a Separation, History of the Partition Through Material Memory, published in 2017, a book chronicling stories from partition witnesses and the relationship with objects that they've held on to since 1947. We also have Navda Malhotra, who works in digital communication and is a ceramic artist. She has worked with Greenpeace India and currently works as a digital strategist at Purpose, an organization that uses storytelling to help activists and businesses make sustainable social change. And that their last names are the same is a coincidence. So together they have founded the Museum of Material Memory, which is a digital repository of material culture of the Indian subcontinent. And it traces family histories and social ethnography through heirlooms, collectibles, and objects of antiquity. So this archive has personal histories based around countless objects, including jewelry, textiles, photographs, war medals, buttons, furniture, and I can go on, but I will turn it over to the founders of the museum. If you have any questions to ask of our two guests, please just ask them in the Facebook comment section, and I will, at the end of the talk, bring those questions in and ask Anjal and Navda about them. So Anjal and Navda, can you tell us why you started this digital archive and what is exactly in the archive?
Thanks, Sadia, for the very kind introductions. And it's such a pleasure to be a part of the Lahore Lit Fest, even if it's virtually. So let me start a little bit by the origin of the archive and why we started it. As you mentioned, my work details the partition through material, culture, and objects that refugees carried across the border on both sides while they were migrating. And one of the things I noticed while I was doing my field research from 2013 to 2017 is that a lot of people would get in touch with me to come to their houses and archive things. So I was trying to base the journey of migration and the home that people had left behind through objects that they chose to carry with them. And what these people were saying to me is, I live in Ranchi, can you come and see this thing that we carried? Or I live in Karachi, or I live in Lahore or Peshawar. And sometimes I could go to those places and other times I couldn't. But it really got me thinking about the archive and how in South Asia, we are not people who keep archives. We are people who rely on oral storytelling. So we're not really good at keeping physical things. We don't understand the nature of things. Sometimes we have aged objects in our house and we don't even ask their relevance or importance. And another thing that was happening, and I think it happens with a lot of us, that when we go to museums overseas and we see their collections of South Asian art and artifacts, often they're incredibly mundane things that we all have in our houses. And the fact that the object is displayed without any context of the storytelling, without any context of the culture or the tradition or the customs around that object really got to me, and I think they get to a lot of us. So what I started thinking about was, I would love to create something digital. I would love to create something that people can contribute to so that a scholar doesn't have to go to their homes to say, show me this object, or let's talk about this and let's talk about this significant historical moment. And the thing was that I was very clear that we had to go beyond partition. Partition is just one event that affected the subcontinent. We wanted to look at all kinds of items of age, heirlooms, objects of antiquity, objects of mundane nature, objects of precious nature. Navda and I have been friends since high school. We share the same name. You said it's coincidental, but actually we share a lot of common interests as well about the archive, about archiving history, about intergenerational conversations at home. We care a lot about the family structure. So I discussed with Navda that I think that we should make a digital archive that is contribution based, that looks at material culture from the subcontinent, that people can write about things in their home. And thankfully we were on the same page about a lot of things. And I want to hand it over to Navda about how we went about building the archive, So Navya, take it from there.
Thanks, Anchal, and thank you, Sadhya. Very excited to be here. So as Anchal said, we started in September 2017. That's when the archive was actually born. And we're 3 years in now. We've crossed 75 stories. And I think it was really important to get something which was accessible to a lot of people, right? Like, I think there's also a thing in India and the subcontinent, as Anchal said right at the beginning, you go outside and you visit these museums, but how do you start talking about things, objects that are closer to home? I think Anchal and I both come from families, similar family backgrounds, and I think that's where our common interests in history also stem from. And we were both very keen that these voices should be heard. These stories need to be coming out. So we started off by building the website, and then we realized that, of course, we have to be on social media to crowdsource the objects that we have. I remember when we started, it was based on our own personal networks, like literally calling up friends and families, objects that we had spotted at people's houses, objects that we have within our own homes. We started off by documenting those, and then started our Instagram and our Facebook. And that's when submissions started rolling in. I'll be honest, it has taken us some time to get things rolling, because I think just our culture, writing doesn't come as naturally. So as Anchal said, it's a lot about oral conversations. Also, memory is a very different, very, very tricky thing to talk about, especially when, it contains human emotions and people's stories, and you've actually lived through these experiences. And that's when we found that if we get people to start talking about what they've gone through using an object, it makes it so much easier. And we were very keen, as I said earlier, to get these voices to the forefront. I think, Sadia, you also mentioned that we have about 7 categories on the website. So we tried our level best to actually ensure that different types of objects were getting covered. So we have books, we have documents and maps, we have heirlooms, household items, jewelry, and also photo archives. And it is really exciting to see that a lot of those categories have got covered. Some stories, of course, like we do get a lot more like jewelry submissions, but we are working very hard to get more diverse objects in. Also, just another thing to mention that I think one of the big, very, very unique things about the archive, of course, it's digital, it's crowdsourced, but also that you're not separating the person from the object, right? But that makes the job so much harder because you're just reading it. So we try very hard, we work really hard to ensure that the experience of reading the person's story is as visual as it could be when you're in a physical museum or an art space or an art gallery. So we do work quite closely with each individual who submits a story. I think it takes us a few weeks, about 3 to 4 weeks minimum, to actually unearth the memories, the stories, and get really good quality photographs to ensure that anyone who's seeing it actually feels like they're right there. And I think over time we'll start experimenting. We are keen to experiment with different mediums. Right now we stick to a lot like narrative and photos. We've just started dabbling in videos, but over time with more capacity, I think we want to start playing around with the medium of how the objects are showcased on the archive as well.
Yeah.
Can I add to that? So one of the other major concerns, at least that I had, because my work is about partition, is a way to use the archive to bring people of the subcontinent together. And I think, as Nava mentioned, the fact that it's digital means that it's borderless. But also we have noticed the object is a democratic space. So say, for example, we post a story of, let's say, a kitchen utensil used in Peshawar, and someone from Nepal reads it and says that, oh, I also use this. And someone from Bangladesh reads it and says, I also use this. And someone from Kerala and Kashmir also commenting and saying, we use this in our kitchens as well. And we have an example of such an object in our presentation later. But what that does is, it doesn't mean that someone from Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and India are talking. It just means that the object is connecting people throughout the subcontinent in a very seamless way. And I know that I strive for that in my personal work. I know you strive for that with Project Dastan always. And I know that that's something that we are constantly building on the museum, how to use the object as a space for conversations that may be able to in some way eradicate this very entrenched border between, the geographic areas.
Yeah. Can you show us some of these objects, like, and you know, how, what they look like, and then how do you start understanding the history of the people that the object is attached to?
Sure. I have a deck here, so I'll just share my screen. Just a second. These are just some of the interest, definitely not favorite. We have crossed over 75 stories now. So these are just some of the objects that we thought represented the diversity of the categories, but also diversity of the regions that the stories come in from. And I think every story that we publish has something so unique coming across, but we just thought we'd share about 14 to 15 objects to kind of, just make the conversation flow.
I think that as we go through the story, we are very interested in the specificity of the experience of the person and the thing. So you may see 4 or 5 different kinds of textiles, but the fact is that every single piece comes with its own story, perhaps its own geographic area, perhaps its own time period. And I think those are really exciting things because as we go through and build this archive, what we're doing is creating an organic archive of material culture. Right? This is a completely crowdsourced, organic that people are willing to contribute to. So at the end, we have something wonderful for posterity and for our future generations.
Yeah. Anshul, do you want to start by talking? Maybe I thought we could actually talk about the Bondi since you mentioned that, just as an example of how conversations, we are facilitating conversations across borders and geographies. I can also talk about this if you want.
No, I can go ahead. So when a submission comes in, generally either Navha or I take it on based on who sees the email first and maybe who is like, I don't know. I don't want to say more interested in a story, but we manage to divide it between us.
You have your own expertise areas, I'm assuming.
We do, but also like sometimes we work together on the same thing as well, which is also very exciting.
I think it's also very much not just email, but we go tracking people's social media. So we stalk people to find objects and then write to them and then follow up. So whoever sees something first, but then, I think personal interest and also working together.
So this particular object is called a Bondi. And the story came from Asansol in West Bengal. And a Bondi is a very particular kitchen utensil used to cut fish. And the woman who wrote the story, Kasturi, went into a lot of detail about how the Bondi was not just used in very specific kitchens to cut specific things, but also that it was a tool of women. And it was a very interesting article actually because she used it as a tool of women empowerment. How though women were confined to the kitchen, they used these tools and they had multiple tools to empower themselves in some ways. And so the moment we put out this particular story, it was like a flood, not just of comments, but also people saying things like, I'm from Lahore and in Punjab, we call it this, and we cut only saag with it. I am from Kerala, we call it this, we cut only this kind of fish with it. It is shaped like this. It has, you see, this one has a little peacock going up, but then there were others shaped in many, many different ways, like knives or swords or kukris. And I thought that, Navda and I both thought, I think that this kind of object was a wonderful way to put a repository of material culture together. So we started collating all of those answers that we got, and we have a kind of literally like a deck of what a Bondi is called throughout the subcontinent in over 150 different ways, and how people remember their mothers or grandmothers or great grandmothers using it for very specific things, which I think is the specificity that we are looking for. That, one thing, it is possible for one thing like this to unite the subcontinent, and objects do have the power to do that.
Can I just add that I think that was one of the most beautiful experiences, right? Like you put up something, it's a cutting utensil. Like it's literally a utensil that's used to chop stuff in a kitchen. And as Anchal said, Kasturi did a fantastic job of spinning the narrative into women's empowerment. And it was all around how, you'll notice that chefs are mostly men, But when you're in the household, it's the women who are actually cooking in the kitchen. And the Bondi is one example of it's a very powerful looking instrument, and it evokes that sense of power when women are doing the cutting. But I think it also prompted people to go back and ask their mothers and their grandmothers, because they remembered seeing the object at their home at one particular time. So we literally had people going, "Oh my God, I've seen this. Let me come back to you with what it's called." And yeah, as Anshul said, we have like an entire list now, and we are keen to take this story further with the many uses of Bontis and the many words used for a Bonti as well.
Yeah. So now that you want to go back and go through the entire thing?
Yeah, definitely.
So as you will see, we have all kinds of different objects, and sometimes the object may seem like it tells a story about one thing, but it can completely go in a different way. This is a great example. So Rashmipuri wrote a story about this dupatta on the left. But while she started searching the story of the dupatta, which had been carried across from Lahore to Delhi during partition, she found this incredible story about the house that the family used to live in Model Town, and how when partition was announced, her particular family continued to live in that house. Meanwhile, another refugee family moved in with them. Rashi comes from a Sikh family. This other family that moved into the house was Muslim. So for 3 months after partition had been announced, a Sikh family and a Muslim family lived together in a Model Town house in Lahore, sharing the space, sharing the food. And I just thought that it was so incredible that when she started searching for the stories of the dupatta and why someone had carried the dupatta across to India, she got this whole other kind of story of unity and kinship that she could have never imagined. She has since been able to find the Model Town house in Lahore and has discovered that it has been broken into 6 different houses now, because you know the Model Town houses in Lahore were pretty big at one point. So this is her dupatta, and also the suitcase of things that the family had carried across from Lahore.
And I think it happens with all our pieces. Like the story starts with an object, and then when someone starts writing it, conversations start. They always manage to unearth something they didn't know about their own family history.
And I think also intergenerational conversations, which are becoming less and less in the subcontinent. So one thing that Navya and I are very concerned about is how much the distance between generations is growing, and how talking about an object often recedes that distance quite quickly somehow. This is another really actually beautiful story. In India, we have Sindu that married women wear in their mang, like right here. If you're married, it's a marker, very traditional marker that you're a married woman. And Harsh wrote this story from the perspective of his mother's collection of sindoor danis. And in the area that he is from in Bihar, a sindoor dani is given to a new bride with not red sindoor, which is very common, but an orange kind of sindoor, which is very particular to the Bihar region, along with a pink sindoor, which is particular to other regions as well. So he took the story from that perspective, from how the sindoor is a marker of a married woman's life, how these sindoor danis were made as per the class that the person was from. So metal ones for people that came from zamindari families, wooden ones for people that couldn't afford that metal, or what kind of metal as well. And then he took it to how that culture is treated today. Do people wear sindoor, and who is going to get this object in his family as well? So again, it was really particular to his experience, but it did speak about the larger tradition of using sindoor today.
I think a few interesting things that came out with this story. One, it told us about the Chhat festival that's celebrated in Bihar, because the sindoor is actually it's closely associated with that festival. And his mom's name is Kamla, and when he spoke to his 95-year-old grandmom, she mentioned that she started getting this designed about 6 to 8 months before his mother's wedding was going to happen, and she worked very closely with the karigar, and it's actually in the shape of a lotus. Because
where would you place this object in, like what year of like?
Oh, it was built in, it was forged in 1960.
Okay.
It was forged in 1960, and as Nanda said, that the grandmother actually sat with the jeweler, because jewelers would make these things. Like, look at the ornateness of the object. and the woman's name is Kamla, a lotus.
Mm.
And this is shaped like a lotus. So I think that one of the things that we really stress on is the photographs, because we are a digital archive, because we want to double up as a research archive. We think that the visuals should be equally as strong as the storytelling. So we often work very closely with people to get the best possible photographs of things that they can.
Okay. Oh, I can talk about this one. It's a pretty personal object. I think it's one of the first few stories that actually went up on the archive. It's my story. It's a story that I've written about my paternal grandfather, and my family does come from Pakistan. All four sides have moved to India in 1947, and my granddad was really unwell when he was alive, when I was a kid, and he'd been diagnosed with Parkinson's, and anyone who's seen that disease knows that a person's body and speech stops functioning, and I could never talk to him. And I knew that he had all these stories to tell because he had been a freedom fighter and he had this incredible history. He studied at Banaras Hindu University. He was a political prisoner. And I was never able to speak to him about any of that when he was around. And after his death, I remember, we had, there was a tiny alcove in the house, and my dad and I were clearing out some of his belongings. And that's where I found this briefcase for the first time. And I think it was in the 2000s that I found it. But when Anchal and I started working on the story, we realized that the briefcase actually comes from before partition, so an undivided India, because the bank that was mentioned there doesn't exist anymore and the bank's name changed. So apparently someone in the family may have worked at a bank or gone to the bank or got an account with the bank, and the briefcase had that label. And
the bank that it was eventually swallowed up by Punjab National Bank, and the headquarters of the bank is on Anarkali Chowk. So it was exactly that for Lahore listeners.
Yeah, and when I opened the briefcase, I realized that my grandfather he had documented everything about his life. So we found his passport, we found his refugee certificate, we found the house papers for the plot that we were given. We found our ancestry. So he'd actually traced out our family tree in Urdu, and I've been working really hard to get it translated and updated to share with my nieces and nephews now. And I think for me, it just gave me an opportunity to actually interact with other family members about the experiences that my grandparents had had, because I think my own parents didn't talk about it very much when I was growing up. They didn't talk about the partition. They didn't talk about what the family actually went through. But it's really exciting that the briefcase one is now, it lives with me, it's mine. And I've obviously looked after, protected all of the documents, but it's also something that as I said, the intergenerational aspect is not just between me and my grandparents. I'm seeing it between me and my nieces. So for them, it's actually their great grandfather. And I think just another thing, I discovered that he was a writer, and he would write at every New Year's Eve midnight. He would write about the year that's gone by. We haven't shared those letters yet because they are very, very personal and intimate, but they tell you so much about the times that the country went through, because I think that was his bent of mind. He was an academic, he was an intellectual. So he's literally written about the political history, how Indira Gandhi came to power, how he felt about it, what happened when she was assassinated. He's literally covered all of that. And I think I didn't realize that that's something I do. I have the same practice of writing, and it was just such a revelation that some of the words that I use are actually words that he's used in his letters, and I've never been able to communicate with him. So it's great to know that that connection kind of got transferred in some way.
But I think also another, the fact that I've been privy to those letters and they're fascinating, but also the fact that you always refer to people by their initials, and that was something that your grandfather did as well.
Yeah, it's like he doesn't refer to people with their name. Everyone is the mother or the father, and I do that when I'm writing, and it's mind-boggling. But yeah.
So what's the criteria for you accepting the objects? How old do they need to be to qualify to be in the archive?
That's a really good question. We have a timeline. The timeline is anything belonging to the 1960s or predating the 1960s, but very often we come across an object that's very unique. You know, the story needs to be told, and then Anchal and I quickly discuss amongst ourselves, you know, and we decide to publish it. But this particular briefcase does obviously predate 1947. It's just that I happened to rediscover it after a long time.
Do you find in the the people who are interacting with the archive, or when you are talking to an audience, do you find there is a disconnect with this perception of what is a piece that should be in a museum? Because generally the perception is that something ancient, something very old belongs in a museum, but these things are like literally one or two generations above us. So is there a disconnect, do you feel, and that people in South Asia need to reevaluate what we qualify as an object for a museum?
Anchal, do you want to go first and then I can add?
So I think it's important to say that we are the first digital museum of our kind. There is nothing else like this in the world, which already means that we're changing the perception of what a museum is. The fact that we are digital, the fact that we are crowdsourced, the fact that we work very closely with people to write stories about things. So it's not just, suitcase, 1940s, Punjab. It's literally about the specificity of the person's experience. I think that we need a consistent effort to change the perception of what a museum is. As someone who currently works as a curator of a physical museum as well, I know that that perception will change very slowly, but I think that this is a step in the right direction. Very often, people do write to us saying, I have this thing from the 1800s. Does this work in your museum? But then we also have people saying, I have this book from the 1950s. Does this work? And in both cases, it works. And I think that shows you the breadth of our collection, that we can, because we are digital, we can afford to have such a wide variety of things. Because I think that when you're talking about a landmass, you can't limit yourself to just the geography or just the language or just the person. I think that you need to take a lot of things into account to create a holistic sense of what that landmass is. And essentially what we are trying to do is give you a snapshot view of the subcontinent at a particular time. So we have stories from the 1700s, we have stories from the 1800s, we have stories from the independence movement, post-partition, on both sides. And I think that I personally love the fact that we have that breadth of objects, and we can afford to invite people to write about all kinds of things.
And who is submitting to you? Because you mentioned that a lot of the submissions are jewelry and heirlooms. So it seems that there's a lot of like women who are, keeping these objects safe in a household to be able to, survive to this day to submit to an archive. So what has been like the gender balance of these objects, and do men actually keep keepsakes? They have medals in their watches and stuff. So what has been your experience in how gender has interacted with this archive, and also region, and how that differs region to region?
So I think, can you just go back to the previous slide?
Yeah, and I think I just want to add something really quickly before we answer this one, which is actually, you said disconnect. I think the idea is also to make it accessible by using innovation, right? So that's where also like the type of object doesn't matter. So we rarely ever say no to a story. It's more like mostly about what that story is actually representing. I think just as we are borderless in regions, geographies, customs, traditions, I think we've been pretty borderless with gender. You would be right to assume that women have been the safekeepers of some of these objects. However, this particular story, which is a Sindur Dani, is written by a young man living in Bihar, in Patna. And I haven't personally gone and counted, but I think it's pretty safe to say that we have a pretty solid gender balance across.
I think that men can write about jewelry and women can write about medals, and both have happened in our case. Like, if you want to go a little bit ahead, there are these beautiful Rai Bahadur and Khan Bahadur medals.
Also, like we don't like the gender really doesn't matter, because also gender just as a term, like there's so many layers to it, and it's never come up in a story as to what gender the person is while they're writing this.
Yeah.
But I think that's because also Nabha and I are very conscious of this, have in both our fields of work, we're very conscious to strive to be that way. And hence the archive reflects that, obviously. I want to bring up this because you brought up medals, Sadia. We never say no to anything, right? But we will always work extensively on the piece to make it different from maybe another piece that's very similar in the archive already. What you have before you are medals conferred upon two people during the British Raj. One is the Rai Sahab medal, which would have been given to a Hindu, and the other is a Khan Sahab medal. It's equivalent given to a Muslim. And what is amazing is that till date, we've done 3 stories about Rai Sahab, Khan Sahab medals, or Rai Bahadur, Khan Bahadur medals, and they all show completely different personalities and also facets of people living during the Raj. So one is also written by a man and another is written by a woman. The one on your left, the Rai Sahab medal, is a story that we thought was going to be about the medal, but it turned out to be this incredible story about this family that rose from a Dalit caste up to a person who actually got this medal. So Varun Malik, and we published the story very recently. Varun Malik wrote this story about his family because he didn't know anything about his ancestors. He is an Anglo-Indian, he's half Scottish Irish and half Bengali. And he ended up finding out about his family through the textbooks that he read in Oxford, because there were brothers that rose to the status of earning Rai Sahab medals. And that story was as much about caste as it was about resilience and class struggle and ownership of experience.
Yeah.
The story on the right is written by Sajal, who lives in Lahore, and her story was about a chest that she found of her great-grandfather, and the letters, again, very similar to Navdha's. He was a civil servant, but he wrote letters, he wrote copious diaries, and he also received a Khan Sahab medal for his contribution to his society. So these medals were usually given for social service, people that worked for their society. And I think that the fact that they are the same medal given for 2 such different things gives you the variety of experience also. So we work very hard, like as I was saying earlier, we may have 10 stories about the same thing, but they'll all be different stories because of the person who's written it.
So you mentioned Dalit, you mentioned caste. I want to ask you about the objects of the poor. In many cases, the ability to preserve an heirloom and attach, emotional value to a keepsake depends on its monetary value as well as it's a function of privilege. So I also face this in my research that a lot of the partition stories, we have lost them because either these people were too poor to survive or they didn't survive. So there's various reasons why we've lost the stories of the underprivileged of the subcontinent. Is there any way that we can think about how to preserve those stories or access them and their stories to include them in our archives and our research?
Navda and I were just talking about this earlier today, actually.
For bringing this up, Sadia. It's such a valid point, and I think again, the term digital. Like I'm just going to take a quick stab and then hand over to Anchal, but just want to say that yes, you're absolutely right. Like storing objects, also memory is a very privileged matter. However, I think the term digital needs to now start shifting, because I think at least in the South Asian countries, most people have access to digital platforms. So I'm not going to talk about the actual objects and stuff. I'll let Anchal deal with that. But I think we are very keen that in the next few years, we start experimenting with how do you bring that audience online to start even witnessing and reading and sharing some of these stories, because I think both things are important. One is having the objects, but also bringing them into the narrative and the stories. So I think just the term digital, like everyone is on WhatsApp, right? So like, can we start being innovative and creative with the tools and the platforms that we're actually using? Right now, we're just on Instagram and Facebook, but like TikTok, for instance, it's banned in India now, but it was an app that was used specifically by the lower socioeconomic demographic of India. and it threw all of the Instagram influencers that, oh, like, you know, TikTok has been taken up by a very particular class. Anshul, do you want to talk about like actual like objects and?
So this is something that I focus a lot in my research as well, like how to get a broad enough demographic of people who experience, say, something like partition. And I think for our kind of work, maybe going back to square one, going back to field research is a good way to do that, because I do think that you're right, both Sadia and Nata, that it would be interesting to see the kinds of objects that are precious across demographics. But I think that the onus on that, to start that process at least, is on Navha and me to go back into field research like we did in the beginning and start writing these stories ourselves and start recording these stories ourselves to see what we get. So, and I think that because it's just the two of us right now, we have the ability to experiment a lot. And I think some of these things are definitely on our radar as and when, you know, lockdowns open, I guess.
Yeah, just one thing to add, right? Like having access to an object might be privileged, but customs, traditions, values, and memories are not, right? That's something that every living being is experiencing. So it kind of stems from there.
But I also think that the value that we give to the object is contingent on the experience that has been had with that object. Yeah. So an object may not be monetarily valuable for it to be emotionally valuable. And we've seen that through our stories. And not to say that everyone who writes for us is of a similar socioeconomic background. There will always be highs and lows in everything, right? But the fact is that they do have access to technology to be able to write for us, of course.
Yeah. Also time to be able to document.
So I've seen in partition studies, and especially a lot of oral history archives, that a lot of the testimonies are of men. And I've seen your archive, which is very balanced when it talks about both, you know, genders. How are stories from, you've done research on partition stories versus stories about, you know, these objects that have come up later or are not exactly related to partition? How are they different? And how are the testimonies of men and women different in this context?
Natasha, should I take a stab or you want to go?
No, go for it, I can add.
Okay, so one thing that we want to make very, very clear, loud and clear, is that the Museum of Material Memory is not a partition archive.
Yeah.
Right? I think sometimes people mistake that because I am attached to it and my personal work is on the partition, which is a fair point. But we really strive very hard to remove that perception from the museum. Coming to the stories of men and women, another important thing to note with this is that the people who the objects belong to, maybe of our parents or grandparents' generation, are often not the people writing the story. The people are actually the grandchildren, more than often are the grandchildren, which is quite lovely if you think about the generational gap that they are crossing in that conversation. But I think that it is a particular purview into a person's life that you're receiving through that. So it's not a first-hand account, though it may have some first-hand dialogue or quotation in that interview that the person has had, but it is always a study into a person's life and a thing that they once owned. And keep in mind, Sadia, sometimes the person may not even be alive. So the grandchild or the great-grandchild is writing about someone that they've never known. And they're trying to piece together things, which means that a lot of external research comes into play as well. And we're grateful that a lot of people do that research. So in terms of the experiences of men and women, I think it's difficult to generalize because it would be completely dependent on the kind of object. You know, a Bondi could be a very crude kitchen utensil, but it is seen as a tool of women empowerment, right? Similarly, a surmedani or a sindur dani can be seen as a very feminine item, but it is written by someone who's using it as an equalizer. So I think it completely depends on the perspective of the writer and how the interview process goes with their family.
Also, just to add really quickly to that, right? Like, you might be writing about an object that belonged to a man, but you're unearthing it through other people in your family. So for example, the briefcase, I could never go, like my granddad wasn't around when I found it. I had to go to his sister. So that immediately provided such a different dynamic to the conversation and the memories as well, which makes a big difference to the story.
Right. And I think also going back to the story of the medal, you know, Sajal, who wrote it, is a woman. And I think that she obviously focused on things that would bring out her perspective. So she found the medal in this very ornate kind of box, and she focused on the design of the box, which I don't think that maybe her great grandfather would have ever done, you know.
So this brings me to the question of then memory, because generally historians do feel that memory is unreliable. However, you and I work in a field of oral history. So how do you deal with this idea of memory being pliable, memory being not exactly scientifically observable? And how should students of social sciences approach this kind of oral history method towards history and take from it?
Well, I've been a firm believer that oral history is an actual field of study.
Yeah.
To understand, and you know this better than anyone, Sadia, to understand a time that we weren't alive in, we need to understand how people lived and how they interacted with people in their society. I don't think any textbook in the subcontinent, or perhaps even in the world, may be able to give you a detailed or unbiased enough view of how people lived. And we're not looking particularly for unbiased views, we're looking for the versatility of view. We're looking for the versatility of perspective. How can you provide that except with people's voices? So I think what oral history does is that it creates the lived archive. Yeah. And the lived archive can only be populated by people's voices. Right? What we do is to just take those voices and situate it through an object, through a context, in a piece. We tie it together. But I don't think that one should... I don't know. I don't like how oral history is called history from beneath, or, I don't like that, because it's as if to say that history from beneath has someone looking at it from above.
Yeah, yeah.
So the person is building the history because the person is living the history.
Exactly. That comes in again, right? Like, it's not just about accessibility to the object, it's accessibility to the story and accessibility to history. Why does history need to sit within this thing where only academics and scholars can access it? It's lived experience.
Yeah. So like we kind of live in a world where we all have digital personalities as well. So do you think this changes the future of this field when, 100 years down the line, the objects are going to change, the photographs and the way that we preserve things is also going to change. So for those types of like non-tactile, intangible objects, what is the space in, the field of material culture?
Love that question.
It's funny because when we were putting together the timeline for the objects, we were talking about, 20 years later, we'll have to extend it by another 5 years, and we'll have to extend it by another 5 years. And when we are of a certain age, someone who's 20 will be like, what is a phone? A handheld phone. So I think the fact that we're digital allows us a lot of comfort room that maybe physical archives may not have. Yeah. And I think that it allows us a lot of experimental space as well. So like, what is the virtual object, completely virtual object, the invisible object, the non-tactile object? I think that, I don't know if we have any actual answers for what will happen.
Yeah. We don't have answers to what will happen, but Sadia, like, not even to go into the future, like someone submitted a biryani recipe and they were like, is this material memory? And Anjali and I were like, yeah, like, why not? Like, she had the recipe written down by someone in her family, so that became the object, but the recipe was one. Sometime recently, someone asked, can this tree that's grown in my house, can this be material memory as well? So I think it's also just like, I think we're really lucky that because it's digital, we can play around with the format and be really innovative with it. I think we're noticing a shift in like objects already. Not to even think of 10, 20 years down the line. I think the objects that we're coming across are changing. There's stuff that Anjali and I have seen while growing up. I think some of our audiences are younger. So they see something and we're like, actually, this is not that old. But then again, I think it's the experience that you're documenting, which is for us the most crucial.
Yeah. So the periphery, I mean, keeping alive the conversation is really important because, it must be an active process. So every time an object comes in, we do discuss the periphery and the boundary of what material culture is. And I think the fact that that keeps changing is really good because it keeps that conversation alive as well and keeps it relevant to the time.
So what is next for the museum, and how should people contribute? Like, what would be the preferred method to get in touch with you?
I think, yeah, we have a form on the website. People can submit using that. It's a pretty comprehensive form. People can also write to us at hello@museumofmaterialmemory.com. I think personally for me, what's next is extending the number of stories. It's been great during the lockdown. People have had more time. So the number of stories, the submissions that we're receiving, it's a I hate to say it, like during a time like this, but people have had space to actually think and uncover some of these memories. So we've been pretty fortunate to get more stories. So I think one, the number of stories, and two, the capacity. It's just Anchal and I right now, and we invest in every piece just on our own between the two of us with full-time jobs on the side. So I think expanding the team would be something for me.
Yeah,
I think for me personally, and I mean, I know Nabha agrees with this, is the diversity of a geographic area and the kinds of stories about kinds of things, just diversity in general that we would like to see on the archive. Is great that with nearly 100 stories, we have so much geographic area within India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and the diaspora that we've covered. But it would be wonderful to keep adding to that.
yeah.
I think just within the subcontinent, like moving beyond the bigger cities, and towns, like the northeastern part of the country of India, like just getting those stories because our cultures are so vast. Yeah.
So I think we'll wrap up here. I think we've had a wonderful talk. Thank you so much for joining me and LLF for hosting this little talk about history. And for those of you watching, you can explore the archive of the subcontinental objects at at www.museumofmaterialmemory.com. It's a beautiful archive, absolutely must see. And thank you so much, Ansel and Navta, and we'll end the talk here. Yeah.
Thank you, Sadia, and thank you for having us so much, LLF.
Thank you.
Bye.